I'm old enough that when I was in high school, we all read a short story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery, which, is that something that's still? So The Lottery was written in the 1940s, and it's about a town, not mentioned where, that every year has a lottery. And as you read the story, you don't really understand what's happening until close to the end, and you realize this town has a lottery to decide who's going, a random citizen killed by stoning.
Yikes.
Just randomly. And there's some discussion about it in the town, and there's the, this is tradition, this is what we, and I read in high school, very powerful. And then maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I happened to read it again, just as powerful. And that's when I realized, in many ways, the way we don't have a conversation often about gun violence. That's what she was writing about in some ways. That there's this unwillingness to try to adapt and use evidence and make people safer, and just there's this acceptance, and the numbers are staggering. The number of people that die, not just in Virginia, but across the country, every year, and then that means every decade, and then it's constant. And so, it's, when you read that story, The Lottery, it's not clear what you can do to change it, and I worry sometimes that it's not clear how we can have a conversation to change it in Virginia, in our country. And I know you've worked a lot on that conversation and that change.
Definitely. Well, I feel like part of that intractability, a big part of it is rooted in fear, because we're all so afraid of either being shot and killed or of our children either experiencing gun violence directly or being impacted by it through things like lockdown drills at school. When you're immobilized by fear, you can't act. You're not thinking. You're responding. You're either going to fight or you're going to run away from it. And so you see how fear really impacts us. But then you see we're all impacted by the culture we're from. And so regardless of that fear, we respond to that fear in different ways. And so some people, when they're faced with that fear, they want to fight, which I think is why a lot of people want to be armed. They think that, well, I'll fight back. And then there are other people, well, that's ridiculous. You'll never, that's not the proper way to respond. My way is the proper way to respond. What we need to do is to try to remove some of that emotion and look at this as a problem that we can solve. And all problems can be solved. Some of them are very challenging, but they don't solve themselves. So I think that in my work, I try to recognize and validate that fear that people have, regardless of how it comes out. Even if they disagree with me, I try to understand where they're coming from, and I find that's really helpful, especially when you're working with people who have a very different solution than you do. A lot of times you agree on a lot, but if you recognize each other's emotions and validate each other, that can be enormously helpful.
And sometimes it's getting people to respond to the fear with hope that there can be a better way, that might involve some change, might involve some compromise by people, but that the system doesn't have to be what we've built. Because we've had mass shootings seem more prevalent, but we've had gun deaths at a high level for decades. It's not a new problem.
To me, that's interesting because I think people respond very well to fear. Fear-based motivation, but that's temporary to me. I think that people respond, the best way to motivate people and to bring about change is through hope, because people will shut down and break down by fear, but no one wants to live like that. It's terrible. It even affects your physical body. So when someone can come along and say, I know you're afraid, but here's how we're going to change this together, people want to live a better life and they want to be a part of something. We're social animals. We want to be a part of something bigger. So if they can work toward this, I think they'll trust you more. And plus, it's just easier to be hopeful. You feel better about yourself, your community, and other people.
And that is a key part of it. You have to feel like you're a part of something, and you have to feel like you're not being pulled out of the community and the people you know and the experience you've had. So what have you found to be, have you had moments where you felt like that, not that you changed someone's mind, but that you, maybe more to think of it as you open someone's mind to having that kind of conversation? Because again, that's, in some ways, people criticize the NRA. Mm-hmm. But I feel like, because they criticize them because they see it as their influence. Mm-hmm. But in some ways I feel like the NRA, because it has this pattern of, in the wake of a mass shooting or something, not saying very much.
Yeah.
I feel like it's more of a problem that they're not engaged in more regular conversation, that they're not part of some kind of dialogue where we can, as Virginia and as a country, do something to move forward.
Honestly, I think the NRA is a big part of the problem, but I think part of their problem is that they're failing their members. Yeah. To me, and I come from a very different background than a lot of moms leaders do, and I come from gun culture. And one of the reasons I'm involved in this work is because the NRA is exploiting people like me for their own end. Hunters and gun collectors and sportsmen, they deserve an organization that will advocate for them, but the NRA isn't doing that anymore. The NRA is making, gun owners and hunters feel like they're being threatened when they're really not. Right. And I've had those moments with a lot of I own guns, and with a lot of other gun owners talking about what, say, take a piece of legislation. This piece of legislation, maybe background checks, the bill that was, it passed the US House this year. It's now sitting in the US Senate. And the NRA's line is it infringes on the rights of gun owners. And I would sit down with people who would really sincerely believe that line and talk with them about what this bill did and my concerns as a gun owner and how this doesn't affect us. And people, if they can trust you, if they feel like you're recognizing where they're from and that you're not lying to them, yes, we agree on this. But the NRA is convincing very good people who are dues-paying members that this is going to harm them, when it's not. And the more we can do to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people, the safer everyone will be.
Right. And not so much people who have concerns about legislation and what's going to impact, but some of the political leaders who block the legislation. I think sometimes they're a little bit disingenuous with their opposition based on either the Virginia Constitution or the Second Amendment, the U.S. Constitution. And I say that because they announce opposition to most things based on that, without there having been either a Supreme Court or Virginia Supreme Court or any judicial review or comment on it, because a lot of things that get proposed do fit within the Second Amendment, do fit within the Virginia Constitution. But there's this, from the legislators in Virginia often announce opposition based on judicial principles, but they don't actually get to make that call. Right. That frustrates me, that we can't, when we propose this kind of legislation, we can't have some kind of judicial review so that everyone can agree, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it's constitutional.
Right. Well, and to me, it's a cop-out. Legislators, they'll say, well, this doesn't do this, then sit down and find something that will. You're a very powerful person. If you're a member of the General Assembly, you're either deciding you're not going to be a part of this solution, or you don't see it as a problem to begin with. And that bothers me. Gun violence, no matter where you fall in the political spectrum, regardless of whether or not you own a gun, it exists, it's a problem, people are afraid. So let's figure out how to solve it and put aside this, I'm an NRA guy, so I'm going to vote against anything that touches on gun policy. And the opposite is true too. Just find a way to make it work. Be an adult, sit down, do your job. And if they can't do that, then they need to be replaced by someone who will.
Yeah. So how long have you been involved with Moms?
Since, let's see, I started in the Charlottesville chapter as their gun safety. There's a program called Be Smart that talks about gun safety, and it's all about preventing unintentional childhood gun deaths and injuries. And I started that, I think, in 2015. And then just a few months later, I came to Crozet and started the local group here.
So overall, has your experience with that given you more hope or more frustration?
Honestly, a lot more hope. Because Charlottesville's a different town. I'm a good fit in Crozet. This is where I live,
Right.
and it reflects a lot more where I'm from.
Right.
And so my audience in Crozet, which is a very small town, and it's probably politically moderate, although they vote reliably Democrat. It's not, Charlottesville is very, very progressive.
Right.
Crozet is not.
Right.
And our district is in the middle of a very rural Republican district. And so, my audience is rural Republican gun owners, and that's where I grew up. And so I speak that language. I'm not afraid of them. I think they're good people who want
Right.
to do good things and want to keep their families safe. Everybody wants to live in a safe community.
Right.
And so when I talk with people who will come to our meetings initially deeply skeptical, or will hear what I'm doing and they're not quite sure. Once we talk about it a little bit more, they agree with what we're doing.
Right.
And they agree with our tone in Crozet. And I think that's been reflected in some of the events we've done too. This is a small town, it's a small community, everybody knows everybody, and once we kind of put up our flag of what we're doing and what our priorities with our moms group, people, they see the need. So you also have to be patient.
Yes.
The work that we're doing in this town is long work. It's not going to happen in 1 year or one congressional cycle.
Right.
It's going to happen in 10 or 15 years. We're changing hearts and minds.
Right.
Districts like this one are going to be really hard to flip
Right.
for a gun sense legislator. But what we can do is work with the community so that everybody in the community is like, this is a really good idea, and the community changes so that the legislator in the
Right.
position of power will change his mind. That's our
Right.
goal.
I mean, that's a much more effective way to go about it. There's too much of a tradition, I think, in Virginia of relying on change by getting to the legislature and lobbying that way. And we need far more cases of communities organizing and having dialogue, and because at the end of the day, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you actually do respond to your community.
Right.
And if your community is silent on things, you're going to respond to lobbyists.
Right.
But I think it's fair to say in both parties, they react to the voters because
Right.
that's how they get the power.
Right.
But I just want to, from my own sense, local moms doing action groups in terms of specific messages and legislation and all that. To some extent, it's specific to local.
Right.
Right. It's not driven by an
Right.
overall, here's the overall message, this is the overall legislation, this is this. It's people in a community talking about things, coming up with a message.
Right.
I think that's a fair
Yeah.
description.
So the only litmus test to be in Moms Demand Action or to support Moms Demand Action
Right.
is to want a future free from gun violence.
Right.
And how that manifests in different towns and cities and communities across America is going to be very, very different.
Right.
And so the way I explain it to people is we're all on the same team and we're going to the same place, but we're taking very different paths to get there.
Right.
So, and everything is political, especially in today's day and age. I work very hard to leave my political hat outside at the door because this is about safety and gun safety specifically. And I would not be effective here or in a district like this
Right.
if it seemed like I was pushing a political agenda.
Right. Right.
But everybody wants to be safe. If you're talking about someone's safe home and safe community, they're going to hear you better.
Right. And we do need, and to some extent, to be pushing a legislative agenda because we do need change
Right.
in some of our law regulations.
But you can change a legislative agenda by changing your delegate or your state senator or your congressman's mind.
Right. Oh, exactly. Right.
That's
It's
change.
not-
And I think that's actually more impactful because this issue right now is seen as a partisan issue, but this should be absolutely nonpartisan. I think it will happen, and I will be so excited when it does, when it is a nonpartisan issue. We
Right.
should talk about this the way we talk about taxes or foreign affairs.
Right.
Everybody has an opinion, and you figure out how to get it done.
Right.
Both
Yeah.
parties should have a claim in this.
And I mentioned that we've had too much gun violence for a long time, but I think it's also true we have not had it so defined in a partisan way
Right,
forever. There was a
right.
time when it cut across parties because it reflected more your background or how you're
Right.
looking at things.
Well, and something I think that speaks to that is only recently have we started talking about how gun suicide is gun violence. And
Right.
that impacts rural communities more than other forms of gun violence. And we, in rural communities, we need to get better about talking about mental health care and talking about suicide. But that's a way, when we start talking about gun suicide, that's a way to make it to show other people how they actually have been impacted by gun violence,
Right.
and that there's a way to honor someone who they've lost to gun violence, and that there are things we can do to prevent that in the future. And I think that the more we recognize suicide in particular as a form of gun violence, that everyone will have more, will have more skin in the game, I think.
Right, because it's true that often the underlying problem is the mental health, and we all need to do better about mental health resources. And it's, in some ways, I think, shameful in Virginia that we have not.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, in the moment, that presence or access to a gun
Right.
changes a mental health problem, can change it into a suicide
Right.
before you can intervene. And no
Right.
one can intervene
Right.
all the time, even with the best sourced resources.
Right.
And I don't know specific statistics for this area or Virginia, but teen suicide have been increasing.
Yeah.
And veteran suicide have been
Exactly.
increasing.
Yeah.
And we've had questions about the Veterans Health Administration care, and it's able to reach veterans. We need to fix that, but at the same time, we need to take action so that we can fix that and we can save people.
Right, yeah. No, and that's powerful out here. The teen suicide rate in our House district is on the rise, just like it is all across the country. And veteran suicide for me is a particular concern. I have two brothers who are Marine veterans, and they are active duty combat vets.
Right.
And both of my parents are veterans. And so I think some people who don't have that connection to the military community, when you talk about veteran suicide, they know that it's bad and we should do something to fix it, but this to me is a very real threat. My family has known people who have killed themselves, and it's terrible. That has an impact for years and decades.
Yes.
And so, and it is a thing, we're failing people when we fail to do anything to prevent it. And one of the best things we can do is to put additional barriers between an individual who's in a moment of crisis and access to a gun. Because one of the most shocking statistics is that, suicidal tendencies, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, you can be parasuicidal. But if you attempt suicide with a method, any other method beside a gun, your rate of completion is around 10%. But if you use a gun, if you attempt suicide with a gun, it's over 90%. So the majority of people who attempt with a different method will survive, and almost none of them go on to attempt a second time. Right. So it's really the gun that's the problem. If you remove that gun, and I get this argument, well, if you're suicidal, you'll just try until you complete the suicide. That's not always true. In fact, most of the time it's not. Right. You're having a moment of crisis. You need easier access to mental health care than you do to a gun.
And often, even when they use a gun, there's a subconscious element to where it is more a cry for help than it is a firm decision to end your life.
Right.
It's that.
Well, and studies show that a lot of people who are actually suicide survivors themselves, they report that they started seriously planning their suicide within 10 minutes of their attempt. Right. So you can be suicidal and seriously depressed and very, struggling, and not be in that moment of crisis. But if you are, that is a sign that you are headed to a moment of crisis. So you do need help then. But that moment of crisis, when you're in that moment, you don't need access to a gun.
And that's what people often say, I can't understand it. Last week I saw him.
Right.
He seemed, and on the veterans, thank your brothers and your parents for the service, but I think it really hits home with veterans, and I'm not a veteran. Because even if someone comes back and doesn't suffer from PTSD, there's a very high likelihood they have a close colleague who is and is at that risk. Mm-hmm. So it's going to touch their lives.
Yeah. Well, and it's latent. I mean, both of my brothers have fought in wars. Yeah. And if you go to war, it's a trauma. You're experiencing a trauma. And a lot of times the way we deal with trauma, some people can experience a trauma and go on, and it never seems to impact them. But a lot of people will experience a trauma, and it can manifest in any number of ways. It can take years to come out, or it can come out immediately. You just don't know. Right. And so we need to keep a better eye on people. And I think, you mentioned the VA. I think that's where some of the concerns with the VA are. But to me, it's like, that's a long-term, mental health approach where systems have to change. Right. What we can do right now to help veterans coming back is make sure that if they do exhibit signs of suicide, they don't have access to a firearm for a very brief period of time until they can be assessed immediately. And that can save their lives.
I'm kind of interested in what you think about might be possible legislatively
In Virginia?
in Virginia. So I'm kind of interested in your kind of sense.
I testified recently at the Virginia State Crime Commission, and it was on the package of gun bills. It was for the special session that got booted to that commission. And so when I was there, I saw advocates for, gun rights advocates and gun safety advocates and some other state officials make their best case for this panel. And one thing that I really thought was no one has an argument against background checks. It doesn't exist. We all know, and it's something like 94% of everyone, including gun owners, Republicans, NRA members, we're all on board with this. The problem right now is in the legislature. So what we need to do, and I think we've done it, we being advocates, not just gun safety advocates, but advocates across the spectrum of everything. Everyone agrees on this. What we need are the legislators to follow the people on this. I think background checks, we must get it done. I think we're close to getting it done. And that, I think, will be it's the foundation of all gun sense. When we expand them to include guns sold at gun shows and online, I think we'll have to see how this affects, gun trafficking and gun sales and homicide and all of that, and I think it will make a difference. And then from there, we should go on to solve those problems. Another bill I saw that a lot of people advocated for was an extreme risk protection order, which is also called a red flag law. I think these are life-saving bills. I am sure we need one in Virginia. I know people who have died who probably would have been saved by one. There are people who have legitimate concerns about red flag laws, and I want them to be a part of the conversation and the process of creating one, because we do need to make sure that there's due process and that the Second Amendment is respected for every individual, but these bills include that. And so I think that if we get legislators who take the approach of being pragmatic problem solvers and who have constituents who trust them more or less, I think we can get a red flag law, and we have to. We have to do that. One thing that I heard about in the Crime Commission that I don't really hear a lot about, honestly, discussed in the media or in the public, is the one handgun a month law. And there were a couple people who spoke to that, who talked about how that results in fewer homicides. If you make it so that people who buy guns to sell on the street can't access more than one gun a month, it's going to bring down crime. So when I heard that, I thought we should focus on that. Because no one was arguing against it, I think, because it's not on anyone's radar. I'm sure people will argue against it if it becomes an issue, but that's really key, I think.
And that's still, if you just do the math, adds up to hundreds of guns over a lifetime, which can't be described as infringing on a right to have arms in any sensible way, but directly speaks to gun trafficking and exporting crime to places like New York.
And I think that's a good bill to focus on, because you can see that it solves a specific problem. This doesn't go after a way of life or a broad issue. It's focusing on a specific problem. There was another bill that was sponsored that we don't really talk about much, but I know law enforcement supports it, or some law enforcement officers support it, that if you lose your gun or if it's stolen, you have to report it to law enforcement officers. And this helps law enforcement officers track crime, and so that's it's common sense. We should be doing this. So hopefully this election will either change some seats to be gun sense legislator seats, or it will change the math somehow so that people will come to this issue on their own.
And I don't know to what extent this gets talked about already, but for things like the background checks and the red flag laws, I would hope the legislation could have, or there could be an understanding, that there would be a very formal effort to study the impact, because that's also where we've come up short on gun violence, is because of restrictions put in place by Congress. We haven't studied the data, we haven't seen it as a problem and tried to find an evidence-based solution. And so it seems to me that dedicating some budget and some funding, and there's organizations not just within Virginia government, but at universities that could do a very good job of, we've adopted background checks, let's see what impact it's having. Because we do need to know that.
Oh, absolutely. the ban in Congress needs to lift that ban immediately.
Right.
We don't know what we don't know. And frankly, some of the solutions that are being proposed, they sound very good. They make common sense, but we don't know if they're actually addressing a problem because we don't have any evidence of how the problem is manifesting throughout the country, throughout different cities. We need research, and there are very good academics. There are some at UVA who are very well prepared to study this. They just need to be allowed to do so. They need funding for it.
It's like asking someone to fly blind.
Yeah.
You wouldn't get on that plane. You shouldn't get into that gun system, whatever phrase you want to use.
And if you do that, it removes the emotional argument from the issue,
right.
and it removes the sort of cultural battle of it. Because you can say, look, this, whatever it is, this is a problem. And 5 studies have come out saying this is a solution. This isn't about what this group is trying to make it about. It's about solving this problem. It's about preventing these deaths. It's about preventing these injuries. Then it's harder to gear up with this fear-based argument.
Right. So to what extent do you see a generational change occurring?
I think
in your community?
I think there is a big generational change. The issue for me is broader. It goes out to the nation.
Right.
So when I read about this, and more importantly, let me back up. When I talk about gun safety and gun violence with high schoolers here in Crozet, they're influenced by the Parkland students, and they're very much motivated by the Parkland students, and so it's easy to feel really hopeful. But then I'll read articles about high school students, in different areas, like North Dakota or Montana, and they are being influenced by very different factors, and they don't necessarily take the same views as the high schoolers here, and they're going to grow up to be voters too, and if you want to create meaningful, sustainable change, you have to influence everyone. We all have to kind of accept this as a good thing. So I think it's unwise to rely on a particular group of young people, plus that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on them.
Right.
Like, we still have to reach out to different sort of cultures within America and try to bring us all together on some factors here.
And in some ways, the 2 biggest challenges we have in that very important mission is we don't have internet connectivity everywhere.
Yeah.
But also we haven't really figured out how to make the internet actually good for democratic dialogue all the time. So we need to work as a community on both of those fronts.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, there's definitely a problem with access, with internet access. And my state senator one time compared it to electricity in the 30s.
Right.
If you have people who go home and can turn on the lights, they can do their homework and they can do all kinds of things. And the kids who couldn't do that were just destined to fail. And it's the same way now with internet access. You have a kid who can come home and do their homework and has access to the world, and kids who don't, they're destined to fail. It's very, very hard to overcome that. And so I think you can't overstate that.
Right.
But to me, I think social media can be very, very good, but it can also be enormously destructive.
Yeah.
We are not good about checking facts. By we, it's the powers that be, because I don't think very few people go out intending to lie and manipulate. But some of those people who do intend that are very powerful, and so they've been able to do that. To me, there is enormous power in communities. Communities don't function online. They're not on Twitter and Facebook. There are some people who find each other that way. But if you want to make change, you have to go out and you have to actually meet people. You have to talk to people, and you have to meet them where they're at. Right. And so that doesn't mean you have to bring your own idea. You go and you listen to them and hear what their ideas are. That also means you have to physically go where they are. Right. It doesn't mean you can find them on the internet.
Right. And we need more of that kind of community meeting and more of those sort of town halls.
Yeah.
But even there, we need to do it in ways that are civil and not disruptive. And I know in Virginia, some elected leaders have shied away from town halls. They felt they were being confronted too much. Whatever we do, we need to do it in that civil way and have a strong dialogue, an honest dialogue.
I think so, and I don't know how civil or town halls, I think, are a double-edged sword. They can be interesting, and you can learn about a legislator's position, but they can also, you probably have a really small chance of asking your question.
True.
And even if you've got someone who you support who's genuinely trying to do a good job, they're not really going to be able to engage with you. They have a couple minutes per question, and they're very broad, So to me, I'm more interested in having legislators who will meet with me privately or whose staff
Right.
will engage in a meaningful way, who I feel like they receive our input and they're actually working with us.
Right.
That to me is much more valuable. And we try that here at all levels and with varying degrees of success.
Right. But I also think, to get back to town hall for a second, I also think we need more town halls that don't involve legislators, that just involve communities.
Right, the old school town hall, or
Yeah,
real town hall.
gathering to talk about an
Yeah.
issue that doesn't come in with doesn't have a starting point and doesn't have a predetermined conclusion, but has that space for people
Yeah.
to get a sense and share the views.
Yeah, community space.
Yeah.